Hey, morning, everybody. It's Tim Major here. Welcome to our first meeting event of the year. It's good to see faces this morning. I'm just a warm-up pact. You haven't got to suffer me, so don't worry at all. David, good morning to you. Thanks for the wave. We need more of those waves as we carry on. This is the very first event of the year, and I have to say, why is it I feel a bit nervous about doing this one. I can't tell you how many events I did last year, and I reckon I spoke to about 1,000 people at events last year. So why I should be worried about this one, I don't know. But it's really good to see you. January is always that dark month, isn't it, when we try and get ourselves motivated and moving. And what better way than to begin with economics in the month of January, first day. So it's good to see you. Although the screen is filling up before my very eyes. I think we're about there by the look of it. And it's good to see some familiar faces and some new faces, because that's what it's all about through your membership. Without further ado, before I introduce you to the protagonists of our event this morning, let me introduce you to Mr. Paul Britton, who's the Chief Executive of the Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce. Over to you, Paul.
Fine introduction, Tim. Thank you very much. Happy New Year to you all. I hope you did manage to enjoy a safe and happy holiday period without disruption. I think that was the key. Thank you for joining us. This is our national and regional commentary, our quarterly economic survey, and it's brought to you in partnership with BDO this morning. I can see from the list of participants, we've got the region's key sectors represented. I can see we've got healthcare, transport, tech, professional services, and friends and colleagues across local government as well. As Tim says, familiar faces. But I do note that, and I was just talking to David in the pre-session from the British Chamber of Commerce, our outreach into the manufacturing community last week about the around the staff shortage as a result of the Omicron variant has attracted a number of new faces from the manufacturing sector members. So it's a very, very warm welcome. Those of you who are new to this session, you may not be familiar, but I will remind you that we are one of the largest accredited chambers in the UK network. We're one of 53 across the nation as part of the British Chambers, and you're going to hear from David Barry from the British Chamber of Commerce and their economics team a little later on. Brief reflections from me. We've started the year with some of those familiar challenges as we did in the January session of last year. The businesses that I'm talking to are concerned about rising costs of materials, and there's been some colourful expressions, so we'll just leave it at that, around the increasing paperwork used and are required now to import goods from the EU from January 1st. We may hear more about that from our international trade members as well later on, and of course recruitment remains tough, and yet there are members that are reporting good growth. So the QES has been one of the most important pieces of work for the Chamber, one of the important pieces of work that we do on your behalf, because we take all this information, all this data, and it helps us to inform our lobbying into government, and we want this event to inform also your investment decisions for the quarter ahead. Before I hand over to Tim, I just want to thank BDO for their support through 2021 and into 2022. It's given this programme of work new reach and impetus, and it's important not just for our work on behalf of you, but also for the BCC, who count on the completion of the surveys and also the feedback that you're going to give us today. So a very warm welcome again, and Tim, back to you, sir. Good morning.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Thank you for that. But you don't want to hear from me anyway. But I just warmly welcome you once again to this Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce first economic event of 2022, as we reflect and understand the outcome of our Q4 quarterly economic survey. This is, as many of you may know, this is the UK's largest survey of business sentiment and a leading indicator of UK GDP. The survey is approximately 5,500 firms across the country. For context, the Thames Valley elements, which Danny will briefly talk about coming up, is the Chamber has Slough head office, Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire, Swindon, West Berkshire, Woking, Reading and Bracknell, which you can see is really the powerhouse for the UK. This is more than just a survey. It's a reflection of our business and business community, and to you, everybody out there, as our business leaders that help drive the economy. Together, we can make a difference. But let me introduce you to the panel. First of all, let me introduce you to Danny Dartnell, who is a partner in BDO. Danny specialises and is head of restructuring at BDO, who are based in Reading, and they're one of the UK's largest accountants and business advisory firms. And their website tells me they have offices in 167 countries. Danny, have you been to them all? I mean, that's a key thing, isn't it? We're also joined by Professor Uma Kamavati, who's Professor of Economics at the University of Reading there. She teaches macro and microeconomics, and also researches, including a number of areas, including women's labour markets, participation, as well as well-being and life satisfaction. Uma, welcome to you. And finally, but by no means least, David Baria, head of research at the British Chamber of Commerce, who joins us each quarter. Who's head of research, and also David is a graduate, just for Uma's benefit, of the University of Birmingham. Before I just hand to David, just to say we've got keep the cameras on, because at the end of when we hear from David, Uma, and Danny, then we'll do a Q&A. For those of you who'd like to ask the questions in person, you're going to have to flag it up to yours truly, do the ubiquitous raise a hand or just wave to me madly on camera. If we run out of time, I apologize. So keep your question or observation, I may say. It's not, sometimes a question comes to be an observation, the panel can talk about it, but keep it short and concise so that we can get to the point and get in as many points as we can. But please don't be shy. And for those who do want to be shy, chat box also works. So don't worry about that. Let me hand you over now to David Baria from the British Chamber of Commerce. David, over to your good self.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tim. Hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here today, and I hope you had a good new year. Really, just to briefly reiterate what Tim and Paul have already said, really, what I'll do is touch on the key headlines from the quarterly economic survey at the national level. But again, to reiterate, this is an incredible piece of research that we conduct, and it's all down to your participation. Without your views being heard, we wouldn't be able to run this project. And what we do with this data is that we take it virtually on a daily basis to central government. We speak to the Treasury, Department for Business, Bank of England, virtually on a daily basis looking at this data. And the monetary analysis team within the Bank of England actually brief the Monetary Policy Committee, who ultimately set interest rates, on what the data show. So this is an integral piece of information that's built into the fabric of UK economic policy making. Of course, Thames Valley is a really seriously important component of this, and the mix of businesses within the region really lend itself to some great analysis, because we've got such a broad range of business types as well as very high productivity businesses within the region. So it's almost quite a good bellwether to look at Thames Valley alone. And I think once Danny touches on the local data, I think you'll probably see some similarities with the national data that we're seeing. So hopefully you can see my screen. Let me know if not. Obviously, the quarterly economic survey forms part of the BCC and Chamber Network's research programme, but alongside that, we also run a series of more topical polls on specific issues like Brexit, trade, COVID, etc. So we try and add some more detail to the issues that are flagged up by QES, which we can certainly draw on. We actually released the national data for QES last week on the 6th of Jan, and it was one of those times where I think a convergence of news stories sort of gave this some leverage, and so we got quite a lot of coverage on Sky News, BBC News, across the web as well, on what the results were showing. So those, I'll touch on the headlines, go into some of the detail, and then really it'd be great to get everyone's thoughts about whether it's correlating with what you're seeing. Now, of course, QES is an aggregate figure. It's not going to reflect necessarily the individual experiences of your business. So what we're looking at here is the broad overall picture. And what we're seeing, just for context, we get, as Tim mentioned, we got about 5,400 businesses responding. The sector makeup is really important. We've got about 27% in the manufacturing sector and 73% in the service sector. Most are SMEs, so 93% of the sample are SMEs. And the field work, of course, took place in November, which means that we closed the survey before the announcement about Omicron and the subsequent restrictions, but we'll touch on how we could measure the potential impact of that shortly. So what are the results telling us for this quarter? In the highest levels possible, what I think the results are telling us is that business conditions are generally in a holding pattern at quite a low base, or a low base compared to where we were pre-COVID. And the challenge basically is that firms are facing unprecedented inflationary pressures and unprecedented skill shortages. If we look at each, QES obviously gives us a big range of indicators that we can package up. I think in very broad terms, what we can say is that the domestic economy clearly showed signs of reopening in Q4, as it had done in the previous couple of quarters as well. And we know that because almost half of firms were reporting increased domestic sales, which was really positive, and that's much higher than the pre-COVID churn that you normally get here. So there were clearly more firms reporting improvements to domestic sales. But unfortunately, I think the positives broadly end there, really, because other indicators that we use for deeper structural conditions like cash flow, investment intentions, and even export sales appear to continue to show no signs of recovery. And in fact, some of them have actually worsened. We'll touch on that shortly. There are basically two massive disrupting factors in all of this. The first is inflation. So we've seen record numbers now, highest levels on record of the percentage of firms expecting their prices to increase, and also those citing inflation as a concept as the top factor of concern to their business now. And the other factor is recruitment difficulties. So again, this has hit record highs as well when we measure it. Now, the Omicron restrictions, I think we can safely assume, while it's not picked up in the data, they will have had a compounding impact on all of this, particularly for the hospitality sector, who somewhat tragically were actually the sector most likely to show signs of recovery in Q4. So I think based on previous waves that we've seen, waves of COVID and subsequent restrictions, we can probably expect the optimistic view that we saw this in Q4 probably to decline since then. So in terms of some of these figures, don't worry about reading too much of the graph. But what these graphs will show is basically the proportion of firms reporting an increase in a given indicator, no change, or a decrease. And this goes back to 2017. So we've got a pre and post COVID comparison. And what you see for domestic sales, and in fact, all of these indicators, is a massive spike in the percentage of firms reporting a decrease at the start of the crisis. So in Q2 2020, 73% of firms reported a decrease in sales, but this went across the board for all of the indicators. That was unprecedented. We've never seen such a dramatic shift. Now, for domestic sales, as I mentioned, in the last 2 or 3 quarters, actually that indicator has materially improved. So we've got almost half of firms in the past 3 quarters saying that they're seeing improvements to sales, domestic sales, and only really about 16% reporting a decrease. So I think the trajectory for domestic recovery, according to this data at least, was certainly taking place. And when you look at the sectoral split of this for Q4, you see actually fairly broad-based improvements across all sectors. As I say, 45% were reporting increases overall. Pretty much all the sectors that we measure were in line with that, with the exception of consumer services to some degree. Hotels and catering firms, so hospitality, they were the most likely to be reporting improvements to sales in Q4. And again, this is where the tragedy comes in, I think, because that will clearly have diminished quite substantially. And some of that could have actually been in anticipation of the winter period, Christmas bookings coming in. So I think that 55% figure that you see there is probably going to drop quite substantially based on previous evidence that we've collected on this. So that was domestic sales. On cash flow, which is an important measure of overall business health, we're not seeing that recovery taking place. In other words, we're not seeing the same proportion of firms report improvements. Cash flow is important because obviously it's a sign of overall business health to some extent. If businesses are low on cash, they're not going to be able to invest or expand. And they're obviously more vulnerable to being in distress. And what we saw in Q2 2020 was an enormous surge in the percentage of firms reporting worsening cash flow. And the picture, in my estimation, hasn't actually really improved all that much. So 31% of firms in Q4 report an increase in cash flow, but that really means that you've got 2/3 pretty much still reporting no improvement to their cash flow position. Whereas for domestic sales, there clearly has been that improvement taking place. It's not happening for cash flow, nor is it happening for investment. And in fact, the investment figures are even weaker. So only 27% of firms in Q4 said that they increased their investment in things like plant, machinery, training. The vast majority are still not increasing their investment. And I think that's a symptom of uncertainty, lack of cash, the inflationary pressures. There's a whole range of factors feeding into this that we can touch on as well. So that was business conditions generally. Looking at recruitment and employment, I mentioned the key story here was that recruitment difficulties have gone up quite a lot over recent quarters. And the question that we ask to begin with on this section is whether firms have attempted to recruit. And actually what you see here is that there is a continued increase in attempted recruitment. So whereas in Q2 2020, we look at that as the benchmark now for the start of the crisis, only 25% of firms attempted to recruit, so a massive drop-off in attempted recruitment. Now we're up to 64% in Q4. So there's been a gradual increase over recent quarters of firms going out looking for staff, which again is in and of itself quite a positive indicator. And when we look at the sectoral breakdown of who's attempting to recruit, actually the highest numbers are for, again, hotels and catering firms. That's probably as they were gradually getting back on their feet, they were looking to rebuild and expand operations, but also production, manufacturing, construction, and transport and distribution. These were the sectors that were most likely to be going out trying to recruit in the quarter. So, but while attempted recruitment has gone up, so too has the percentage of those firms facing recruitment difficulties. So now 79% of firms that attempted to recruit are reporting recruitment difficulties for a wide range of roles. For manufacturers, it's typically the technical and skilled manual roles. For professional services, it's the professional and managerial roles. For hotels and catering, it tends to be slightly lower skilled roles. But across the board, recruitment difficulties are going up. And we're at basically record highs now. And no sector, as I mentioned, is immune from this, really. So you've got basically every sector reporting recruitment difficulties in very high levels. And we get some really brilliant commentary back from businesses, and Paul's touched on some of this already. And seems to be a convergence of a wide range of factors. So we've got long-term skills shortage issues that were prevalent pre-COVID, but then since COVID, we've had a global supply chain crisis, we've had Brexit, we've had staff moving back to European Union countries, for example, acute shortages in particular sectors like logistics, which have knock-on impacts. So we've seen a raft of specific issues that have fed into this. Really, finally, the major trend, in my view, is that of inflation now. And what you're looking at is a graph here of the manufacturing sector in the black line and the service sector in the red line. That is basically the QES data that you've seen for previous indicators turned into an index. And you see that for the manufacturing sector, the proportion of firms expecting their prices to increase is now fairly substantially above any historical record that we've seen before. It's also true of the service sector as well. And what we're asking businesses here, there's a few measures that we use for inflation, but here's the main one. We're asking, over the next 3 months, do you expect your prices to change, increase, remain constant, or decrease? And what you're seeing is that 58% of firms overall expect their prices to increase. But you can see straight away, apologies if the text is slightly small, but you can see straight away that there's a wide, quite a serious sectoral variation here. So the sectors that are dramatically more likely to be expecting their prices to increase are manufacturers, construction firms, transport and distribution, and wholesale and retail. And we've got hundreds and hundreds of comments back from businesses across the UK talking about some really scary things, really, in terms of inflation, which I'll touch on. But this is basically the highest levels on record that we've seen. We also, again, lots to take in on this graph, but don't worry about dissecting it. But what we also ask is whether, of a range of factors, inflation is more or less of a concern to their business than 3 months ago. And what we find is that inflation now, for 66% of firms, this is a multiple choice question, but for 2/3 of firms, it's more of a concern than 3 months ago. So it's this blue bar here, and you can just see how it's grown in the last couple of quarters. Typically, in a pre-pandemic quarter, you'd have a usual churn of about 1/3 of firms worried about inflation. Now that's at 2/3. So I think that we are seeing some big shifts taking place in the data. And so what are the specific problems that firms are talking about? In very broad terms, we've got COVID, so the restrictions imposed by government, loss of consumer confidence, uncertainty about the future here. We've got the global supply chain crisis, which obviously overlaps with COVID. We've got hundreds of businesses talking about massive price hikes, widespread shortages, particularly, and we've done quite a lot of research into this, particularly for shipping containers. Steel, cardboard, utilities are going up, vehicle fuel costs are going up. So there's a whole raft of factors playing into that. Recruitment difficulties for things like HGV drivers, but also other acute sectoral shortages, and oftentimes very specific skills like translation or computer programming that aren't necessarily that accessible anyway, and that have been compounded by people, say, moving back from Europe to European Union countries. And then another factor is, of course, the requirements that have flowed from Brexit. So we did a big survey in October on this, and we found, again, hundreds of businesses talking about challenges with new customs procedures, new VAT requirements, rules of origin requirements, loss of access to some EU labour, loss of equivalence, for example, certification marking or financial services, inability to bid into European procurement programmes. So there's a whole range of factors. And here's 3 random comments from this quarter talking about some of the inflationary pressures. So you got a manufacturer in Cambridgeshire talking about double-digit price increases to things like paper, wood, metal, 20%, for paper, 70% for wood, 50% for metal. We've had 600% price increases to shipping containers. So it's a whole package of issues that are flowing out from this. And I mean, this is just a bit of a scrape off the internet, but you can see for all of these sort of commodities, steel rebar, petrol, natural gas, shipping containers, just how far the inflationary pressures have gone over the last year. And this is, you know, it's entirely predictable that we're seeing the data that we're seeing. So in summary, what I think this is pointing to is that the domestic economic reopening was taking place fairly well, but the major factors like the global supply chain crisis, ongoing COVID uncertainty, Brexit requirements have led to basically unprecedented inflationary pressures and recruitment difficulties, which now threaten overall business conditions. And it means that the increased sales are not translating into improvements to long-term business health. And I say this is a general overview. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of exceptions to this rule. But then finally, Omicron, I think, will have compounded these issues. And the next data that we collect in February, the next data set we'll collect in February, well, I think will really show up some of the impacts of Omicron. But with that, I'll hand back to Tim.
Thank you, David. Thanks for your contribution. Excellent as ever. Let me hand now to Danny Dartnell from BDO, who will talk about partly the Thames Valley perspective and the wider issues. Danny, over to your good self.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. And thank you also for my unexpected promotion to Head of Restructuring at BDO. I should probably just, there's a couple of people on the call I know who know me who probably raised an eyebrow at that. So just to confirm, it's Head of Restructuring and Insolvency at BDO in Thames Valley and Southampton rather than nationally. But I think this is the third set of survey results where a partner from BDO has been invited to give their view, very much focused on sort of local results. And back in 2021, in Q2 and Q3, we had BDO tax partners speaking. So we had David Brooks and Carol LePage, whereas as Tim's already said, I'm a restructuring partner, so I specialise in turnaround and distress situations. And just for the record, I am also a licensed insolvency practitioner. But I don't think this was a premeditated decision or necessarily a reflection on our collective view as to what the outturn for 2022 was going to be. But it might mean that you get a slightly different flavour of a presentation from me than you would have had previously. When I was invited to speak back in early December to speak at this session, I was told that there were two key areas that I needed to sort of cover and reflect on. The first was the QES results for the Thames Valley region, and in particular highlighting any sort of key variances that there are between Thames Valley and the national picture. And the second was to give a sort of a personal view on predictions for 2022. So on the face of it, you'd say, well, that shouldn't be too challenging. But the truth is that both of these areas have given me a little bit of a headache. So in terms of the survey results, the reality is that there's very little to choose between the national and the regional picture. So if there's any statisticians amongst you, if you were to analyse the results in the way David's done, you'd see the variances are fairly marginal. There really isn't a great deal to choose between them. So I was reluctant to sort of effectively repeat the analysis and the presentation that David's already done, firstly because it would be a bit repetitive and dull, and secondly because he's going to have done a much better job than I could ever do. And the second problem I had was around my personal predictions for this year. So my invitation to speak came through in mid-December, and my first thought was, well, there's not much point thinking about my predictions now because there's still 3 weeks to go. And that wasn't me putting off my preparations in anticipation of enjoying the Christmas break. I think it was the fact that 3 weeks is a very long time in a pandemic environment. And my thoughts and predictions back in mid-December were likely to be very different come early January. So I decided to go a little bit off-piste, and instead what I was going to do was reflect on a couple of key themes that have come through for me in the results. Specifically things that resonated based upon my experiences over the last couple of months, and also the sorts of conversations that I'm having with either existing or potential clients. And my initial thoughts was I was surprised the results showed quite as much optimism as they did about the current position. I obviously read them slightly differently to David. So expectations regarding sales, orders, exports and profitability. We had, if you combine businesses expecting growth in those KPIs, or at least to stay the same, it was somewhere between 80 and 85% for most of those indicators. But actually there are two key issues to raise there. The first is that these results are pre-Omicron, and that will have had a fairly significant impact. But also, if you look at the number of respondents from the sectors which you would argue have been most heavily impacted by the pandemic, so hospitality, leisure and retail, they actually make up a relatively small percentage of the overall respondents. What was interesting for me were the answers to the questions around the areas of concern for businesses looking into 2022. And the first of those is around staffing and recruitment. So 59% of businesses locally had recruited, or at least attempted to recruit staff during the final quarter of 2021. And of those businesses, 2/3 had experienced difficulties in doing so. So slightly better than the national picture, but still a very large number. And that was particularly in the skilled and professional staff brackets. Now, as it happens, I was actually invited to a roundtable discussion yesterday by one of the major high street banks with their business support team. So those are individuals who are early intervention, so dealing with clients who are exhibiting some sort of sign of distress, whether that's covenant breaches or requests for additional funding. And the bank was clear that they wanted to speak to us specifically about this employment issue, so recruitment and retention. That for them is the #1 topic that they are speaking to their stressed clients about at the moment. And the reason for these difficulties are well documented. So we've had the exodus of migrant workers off the back of Brexit, compounded by the pandemic. We've got certain sectors are being seen as very unattractive sectors to work in at the moment. I'm particularly thinking here about sort of social care. But there's also a kind of inertia that's built up where people don't want to be moving jobs at the moment due to the lack of uncertainty that they have around job security. So sort of staying put and seeing how things pan out. And we were asked to put forward some good ideas that the bank could pass on to their clients about things their clients should be doing to fix this problem. But the reality is that meaningful solutions to this issue are quite tricky. So the obvious one is wage rises. It's quick, it's easy to implement, but of course it has longer term implications and huge numbers of knock-on impacts. So what businesses are trying to do is come up with more innovative solutions rather than just throwing money at the problem. So we're looking at improvements in the broader employment package, so enhanced working conditions, it might be enhanced pension contributions, paid breaks. We're seeing longer term retention bonuses in sectors where these sorts of things just historically have been unheard of. We've got stories of, and this comes from social care again, collaboration with competitors, actually sharing staff across competing businesses, trying to sort of plug those gaps. We're seeing investment in automation and AI, although we recognise this is challenging where there aren't sufficient cash resources, but also this is going to be a longer term solution to the problem. We've got sectors targeting what they're calling passive job seekers. So either people who aren't in work at the moment or people in other sectors who haven't thought about migrating to different sectors. So there are specialist apps now where you can try to introduce a friend. But you get mini bonuses at each stage of that introduction. So introduce someone, get a mini bonus. They get their first interview, get a mini bonus. Get their second interview, get a mini bonus. So rather than people saying, actually, what's the point? Because the chances of them getting a job are very slim. If you're getting those incentives all the way through the process, you're much more likely to introduce people. We're seeing companies setting up staff banks. So trying to bring people on 0-hour contracts to try and manage that issue around sort of peaks and troughs in demand, and of course increasing outsourcing, so trying to take away the problem. Yes, it's more expensive, but actually making the employment issue someone else's problem. What's going to be interesting is to see just how this situation unwinds itself over the next 24 months and the extent to which this is going to repair itself over time, or whether this is a seismic shift which is going to take some time to work through. The second issue I wanted to raise was about what I said a few moments ago about 3 weeks being a long time in a pandemic environment. And I guess there's parallels there with a week is a long time in politics, that famous quote. But the point I wanted to make was that if I'm struggling to pull together some thoughts for a 5-minute presentation about the shape of 2022, how difficult is it going to be for business owners to set a strategy for their company in such a dynamic environment? A few years ago, I wrote an article which was published in Accountancy magazine, which was entitled "Businesses Don't Come with Sat-Nav." And the thrust of the article was that there's no predetermined roadmap which a company can follow to realise their strategy. They can't just plug that destination in and someone's going to tell you exactly how to get there. Yes, they need a plan. Yes, they need a forecast, but they need to be ready to change direction as hazards and roadworks get in the way. Now, we all know on this call that forecasts are important, but the moment a forecast is prepared and published, it's wrong. But every business needs one. They need to include the KPIs that are relevant to your business. It needs to have the important milestones along the way. But really importantly, it's about scenario planning, what could go wrong, and then having a plan B, a contingency plan for if that happens. You hope you never need it. You hope the contingency plan stays in the bottom drawer, but it's a really important thing to have. But in my view, being fleet of foot, being reactive, and being able to be adaptable is going to be the order of the day. And that's going to be a change in mindset for many business owners nationally and, of course, in the Thames Valley. And I think that businesses may have to trade off profit margin for an ability to react in the short to medium term. So, for example, renting short-term office space rather than taking on a longer-term lease for bigger premises. Yes, it's going to be more expensive in the short term, but it gives that ability to flex. It might be holding greater stock levels for key components in the manufacturing space. Yes, it's going to tie up working capital. Yes, there's going to be holding costs, but we all know that we've got supply chain issues which are looming over the next 24 months, and having that ability to weather those supply chain issues may be important, even though that's going to have a negative impact on profit margin. So finally, predictions for 2022, the shortest bit of the presentation. So obviously, aside from England winning the World Cup in Qatar later this year, I'm going to say cautious optimism, but very much tempered by inflation and continued supply chain problems. I think it's going to be a much rockier road for the sectors that have been hardest hit. It's almost going to be a bit of a two-tone recovery, I think. So I'm thinking social care, hospitality and leisure, and retail. But something that's not been mentioned yet, but very much on our agenda, is the ever-increasing importance of ESG. I think that's my time used up. Tim, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you, Danny. That's very kind. Thanks very much for that. We will return to that subject, I'm sure. And the last of our presenters, but by no means least, Professor Uma Kamavati. Good morning to you, Uma. You're on your book. You're taken off mute. Excellent. Over to you.
Thanks, Tim. So good morning, everybody, and Happy New Year. A strange start to the year. When Tim contacted me, he asked if I would reflect more generally about national economic trends and look a bit towards the future. And so I thought I would spend a few minutes this morning on issues that affect the economy nationally. And many of the things that I'm going to say have already been touched on by both David and Danny. And of course, with you actually working, in the economy, in businesses, you're probably all more aware of this than I am. I just see the data and come to conclusions. But it seems to me that the aggregation of some of the issues that I'll be talking about will be what influences government policy over the next few years, and that in turn will influence business environment. Now, we've heard already that businesses face uncertainty at the moment, both in the short and the long term. Now, long-term uncertainty is, of course, nothing surprising. All of us know, and Danny was saying a minute ago, forecasting is really difficult, and businesses are aware that long-term uncertainty is going to happen. But the level of short-term uncertainty we are facing is unprecedented. And, not knowing whether you're going to be able to open up tomorrow or not is really it's a shock of a different kind. And this is revealing itself in a range of economic indicators, inflation being a big part of it, rates of interest, shortages, both of goods and of skills. Of course, at the moment, the core cause of the short-term uncertainty for businesses is the pandemic. And though we seem to have recovered, there seems, as David said, the recovery seems to be a little fragile. And Omicron itself may have an impact on it. It may not. Even that is part of the uncertainty that we're working with. Now, in the case of the UK, there are, of course, two further developments. The first of these is Brexit. And Brexit has been done, and it's been done quite a while ago, but because it came around the same time as the pandemic, the implications of Brexit have not really worked themselves out. And, you know, we've seen businesses talking about changes in paperwork that they have to do. There are implications for trade for UK businesses, definitely implications for the labor market and for supply chains. And all of these will take time to work themselves out. The second and slightly longer term thing that adds to uncertainties, of course, what happens with regard to climate change. Now, COP26 was a big event this year. It's been and gone, or last year really. But of course, you know, it just highlighted the number of things that still remain to be done. And the longer term uncertainty for many businesses will actually relate to climate change and climate change policy rather than the pandemic, which is sort of here and now. Not surprisingly, of course, Brexit and climate change together have given rise to a range of problems which have been touched on again by both David and Danny. But I will sort of just summarize some of these issues. The first of these is the supply chain issues. The pandemic, of course, created major supply chain issues across the world. And I'm sure all of you are better aware than me about exactly how this is impacting production. Now, we saw this at the start with regard to pharmaceutical products and PPE. We've seen it this Christmas, the Christmas that's just gone, with a range of consumer goods and us being told to shop early because there would be less choice. And of course, we've seen it with even with things like oil and gas, petrol at stations. The second big issue, again, that's been touched on this morning repeatedly, is this issue of skills and labor shortages. Now, Brexit, the government's immigration targets, and the pandemic have come together to create significant labor shortages in the UK. The most obvious of these is apparent in the NHS at the moment. You know, the army has been brought in to help the NHS in social care. But actually, these shortages are much more widespread, as we've seen from the data. Careful thought will therefore have to be given to the kind of labor market strategy that the government has, you know, whether it's supplemented by immigration or not. How exactly to deal with this labor market shortage is going to be something that the government has to put its mind to. Inflation, again, we've heard about inflation already. Of course, both supply chain issues and labor market shortages are likely to result in a reduction in supply and an increase in prices. In the post-pandemic period, of course, we've also seen a demand side increase. And this is partly because of effective government policy. You know, the government policy that said we'll furlough staff, we'll try not to let businesses go under. A sort of very clear Keynesian deficit plan was put in place. And this has worked, and it is what enabled the fragile recovery. But of course, that together with the labor market shortages has meant that we've ended up really with inflation on the supply side. There's demand, significant demand, and actually it's pent-up demand on the demand side. And all of this has meant inflation. Now, The Economist argues that the pandemic has seen a shift in demand from services to goods, which for the UK is actually quite a big shift. And if this were the case, then of course, you can see further pressures on prices as well as supply chains. We don't, of course, know how long this shift is likely to last. The last of the issues that I wanted to talk about is the issue of structural change. Now, it's been clear during the pandemic that some sectors have actually boomed. And we know, I mean, it's very obvious to us that the pharmaceutical sector has boomed, but so also the digital services sector and a range of sort of slightly more online, whether it's online shopping or online working type services have really boomed. But there are other sectors, travel, tourism, hospitality, in a most obvious sense, that have taken a knock. And actually, given climate change and government policy with regard to this, they are likely to continue to see difficulties in the future. Now, in addition to the above patterns, of course, government policy is likely to be crucial with regard to where the UK economy at least heads. The end of austerity and increased government expenditure, which was involved in both the furloughing as well as other pandemic-related expenses, has managed to keep the British economy afloat over the last 18 months and has also sort of created an environment in which businesses have sort of survived. I mean, you may disagree with me, but I think there might have been a range of businesses that would have gone under during this period that have sort of been kept afloat because of government policy over the last few months. The question really is what's going to happen when the government tries to fund this package, and that is going to be what hits us once the pandemic is sort of under control. Will taxes increase? Can interest rates really decline any further? We seem to have come to the end of the quantitative easing period policy. Can we really do anything more on that front? Or will the government simply allow inflation to eat into the value of its debts? So in addition to this, to government policy, the big unknown for the future is going to be the government's climate change policies. There is an attempt to be serious about climate change, but serious climate change policies imply structural change, both in the way in which we consume as well as in the way in which we produce. Whether the government will be in a position to push that at this moment in time is a big unknown. And then, of course, there are, as I mentioned earlier, the issue of immigration policies and how the government is going to deal with, sort of squaring the circle between its labor market shortages and any immigration targets that it holds. Together with climate change, I think these are the things that are most likely to influence the UK, the direction of the UK economy. Before I end, I would like to raise the issue of resilience, of course. Now, it's been very clear over the last few months that what the UK and most Western economies have tended to do is to go towards efficiency. And I'm sure all of us are aware of how significantly efficient the UK economy has been, for instance, with regard to the NHS. But, efficiency has its limits. And a really important thing, given the kind of crises that we are likely to face, whether it's a pandemic or climate change issues in the future, is a greater need for both businesses as well as the economy to be resilient. And it's not that easy to plan for resilience, of course, I'm aware of that. And maybe that's what we should be moving our attention towards. I'll stop there.
Uma, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your 3 contributions. I'm conscious of time, and I've got a few questions coming into the chat box. So what I would ask you to do is I'll get Sarah to return us to the big screen so I can see everybody on the screen. If you go down to that little button at the bottom that say reactions, and if you want to raise a hand there, then do so. But in the meantime, I've got a few questions coming in through to the chat box. First question, are we going to see a large number of businesses go bust as the economy recovers, since they will not be able to recover from the losses incurred over the last 2 years? I think Uma and Danny have referred to those 2 points. Who wants to take that one first? Uma?
Yeah, I mean, so as I said, some of these businesses going bust is likely to have happened anyway. So I think we have, the exits that would have happened in 2020 and 2021 are in the wings and are likely to happen anyway. So data might show an increase in exits. Will there be more than that? I'm less able to predict. I think maybe Danny will have a better.
Yeah, I think Danny, you've got some thoughts on that, haven't you?
Yeah, I thought you might come to me first, actually, Tim, but it's given me a moment to think. It's the question I've been asked every week for the last 2 years. And if I had £1 for every time someone said, "I bet you're busy as an insolvency practitioner, I wouldn't need to be working anymore." The reality is it has been very quiet in the insolvency profession since the beginning of the pandemic. I would say rubbing my hands, but certainly expecting a period of intense activity, which just hasn't happened as a result of largely the government initiatives to sort of stall the large number of insolvencies we were expecting. I've often likened it a bit like a bow wave, where the insolvencies have always sort of been a little bit ahead of where we currently are. They're always coming. And to quote the real head of insolvency at BDO, who said, he said, I have predicted the 8 of the last 4 recessions, and it feels a little bit like that. It hasn't happened. The question is it going to come? Well, there are several thousand corporate insolvencies that haven't happened if you just look at the statistics. If you take a sort of an average number of corporate insolvencies on a yearly basis, and then you look at the last 2 years, I think we're somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 fewer corporate insolvencies than we would expect. So the argument is they've got to come at some point. The question is, will they come in addition to businesses that would have survived but haven't been able to, or are we going to see that happen over a protracted period? I think we will get busier this year. I can see there's certainly some of these indicators we talk about. Businesses are going to have a weaker capital base to be able to weather these storms. The government initiatives are starting to be reined back in if they haven't already. So yes, I think it's going to be a challenging year. Yes, I think we will see an increase in insolvencies. I don't think we're going to see a tsunami. And speaking with the hat on of an advisor to a company who may have debt into one of these entities, the issue we're going to have is where there is an insolvency because of the increased level of debt in there, whether that's HMRC through tax, which now has super preferential status, or debt through CBILS and syllables facilities. What you'll see is a lower return to unsecured creditors. So that's going to be a feature of insolvencies going forward.
I think as a follow-up to that question, I can see David nodding as well. So I'll include you both in this next question, which is a good one from Ruth Bagley. Which sectors are lagging in achieving productivity and efficiency, which have the greatest opportunities in AI and digital? That's a great question. Any thoughts, gents, ladies?
I might let David take the lead on that one.
Well, some initial thoughts. I think it's a really good question. Some initial thoughts is that productivity is notoriously difficult to measure in certain sectors. So how do you measure productivity? And it's an ongoing question, but how do you measure productivity in, for example, the hospitality sector? We've got I think they call it the long tail of firms that are not as productive as they should be when compared with other countries like France or Italy. But there's various issues with measuring productivity, I would say, firstly. But in terms of which sectors are lagging, I mean, it depends how you frame it. I mean, in terms of our own data, when we look at sales, certainly the consumer-facing firms have suffered the most recently. And that ties into a previous question from Lee. So we see retailers hospitality firms the least likely to be reporting in, well, historically, since the start of the crisis, the least likely to have reported improvements. And I think that no doubt will have held back their ability to invest in productivity and efficiency. So you might actually start to see this gap widen, if anything, because the smaller firms that were already the least likely to be what we might like to say high productivity have less capital to invest in those mechanisms going forward.
Thanks. Danny, do you want to follow up anything on that?
No, I think that covers it. The only thing I would say is it's businesses that have that sort of high fixed cost base where they're really going to struggle to to vary the cost base based upon large swings in turnover. So I do a lot of work in the education space. So independent schools is a good example where the cost base is all around property, it's all around staffing levels, which can't really be moved. So, relatively small movements in turnover actually have a huge impact on bottom line. So education as an example, but businesses with that high fixed cost overhead base.
Okay, moving over to recruitment, and a good question from Sam Robbins at West Berkshire District Council. Do you have any thoughts on how local government should be supporting and addressing skills and recruitment shortages in local economies? So that's obviously specific to West Berkshire, but I guess that's also relevant to each of our areas. Any thoughts, David, from what you're seeing?
It's a tricky one. I mean, what elements are you thinking, Tim, in particular?
I suppose that, again, the question I've read it as it's, but I guess what they're looking is there any local initiatives that you think may influence the way that the factors within the survey could be moved?
Well, certainly historically, large-scale infrastructure projects at a local level have given certain regions a boost. But the way I would probably look at this is that the factors that are causing the biggest shifts are not really local in nature. They're national and, if anything, international. So where you've got global supply chain crises, for example, they are impacting manufacturers from everywhere from Kent to Aberdeen. There's no local offsetting measure, if that makes sense, to some of the inflationary pressures and global supply chain issues. So historically, when we look at things like local infrastructure projects, Crossrail, East-West Rail, Hinkley Point, things like this, you see a convergence of investment taking place at the local level, which often shows up in the data. But I think we're in a position now where the wider issues will render those local variations quite difficult to identify, in my view.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I'm mindful it's 10:28. I do have a few more questions, but I'll keep those in the bag. I would say to you, thanks for all of your observations and comments and questions. They are important, and I know that David, during his discussions with the Cabinet Office, brings those forward through. But let me just hand over back to Paul Britton, if I may, as we come up to the end of our Q4 meeting. Paul.
Thanks, Tim. I mean, at this point that I reflect on our decision to move from 90 minutes to 60 minutes in terms of the session, because I'm sure we could have pondered a few more questions, because what strikes me is the amount of disruption that businesses have had to deal with. And of course, the Q4 results that we've talked about here haven't yet captured the latest restrictions. And Danny, your words, I think you articulated the difficulties in planning ahead. And also confess, I was of course one of those people that had made that assumption around how busy you and your department would be, and we all take encouragement from that. But it also reflects that many of the Thames Valley businesses have managed to repivot and give that agility that you deliver that agility you spoke about earlier. So for me, I hope this session has given you a chance to step back from the muck and bullets, if nothing else. A growing part of our role is to provide the best alternative to that sat-nav that Danny spoke about earlier, to plan and weather the uncertainty. And of course, the QES plays a key part in that, the advocacy, and local infrastructure projects was also mentioned. It also steers us in providing messages to government around how we can increase productivity and job opportunities, and there are numerous projects, including Western Rail, that we continue to lobby for. The QES also informs which services are most valued. So your feedback around the challenges of dealing with the new paperwork, if you're an importer, if you're bringing imports into the UK, we've launched a new service, a customs brokerage service, to help to deal with those new trade agreements and duty and the VAT liability. So it also helps us to plan on your behalf as well. Final comments from me are just to flag up what's happening next. We will be returning to face-to-face events in good time. We're sticking with online for the next few weeks. We've got online networking events in Oxfordshire, West Berkshire and Swindon this month, actually. And face-to-face, we're returning in February. We will look forward to that across Reading and Oxfordshire in March. We've talked about the Q1 survey and what material impact the restrictions and Omicron may have had on those results. That survey runs from the 14th of February to 10th of March. So watch this space. We'll be reaching out to you again, and the results of that survey is on April the 12th. So please mark that in your diary. We'll be delighted to see faces returning, giving your views on what has changed and how it's changing. But for now, on behalf of everybody at the Chamber, thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to Tim for helping to pull this session together, and to all of you for joining today. I wish you a safe, happy, healthy start to the new year, and good luck with your endeavours. See you very, very soon. All the best.
Thanks very much, all.